speaker is going to tell us about the sinking of the USS Leopold by a U-boat in World War II. The speaker's brother received a Purple Heart for his valor on the Leopold. Please help me welcome Dr. Robert Nersasian.
Okay, it's my pleasure to be here today to talk to you folks. This is going to be somewhat from the hip. I am in the process of writing a book on the USS Leopold. I have never written a book. I've done some research papers and stuff of that nature, and chapters in textbooks, but this is something that struck like lightning. And it's because of that young lady sitting there on her fender somewhere in the mountains of California. That's my firstborn, my daughter Tori. A wonderful young lady. She's going to be 40 in a few weeks. And for some reason, when she moved to her new house in California, approximately 2.5 years ago, decided to clean out some old stuff in closets. And there was a shoebox loaded with cassette tapes. And those cassette tapes had followed her from here. We lived in Middleton at the time, and I am a Salem native. And they went to Denver when she went to graduate school, and they went to California and made several moves, and finally it was time to extricate herself from this extra baggage. And she took out some 15 or 20 audio tapes that dated back probably when she was 16, 15 years old. So it goes back a good 20, 25 years. And she proceeded to play them. There was probably some collector's value, and one by one they just snapped and were gone. And for some strange reason, and I like to think it's the universe, one tape played, and it played beautifully. And I had no idea that this tape had existed, probably since 1988. And it was an interview she had done of my brother, her uncle. She needed to write a paper in a history class, and it had to have something to do with somebody you knew, relative, friend, family, that served in the war. And it had to be one hell of a good essay, or you were not going to graduate from this course. So she dragged her younger brother and sister over to the house here in Salem, coned my brother after a round of golf, and said, "I heard you were in the war." Well, you may ask yourself, didn't you know that? Of course I knew that. And, you know, we'll show you a few pictures here. I'm going to probably stray off the track that I wanted to go on. But in either case, the tape played, and she was a guest. She immediately started to go onto the internet, because now her curiosity at age 36, 37 was far greater than at 16. And she proceeded to find that there was a gentleman who was approximately 88 years old named Harry Daube, D-A-U-B-E, who had received the Purple Heart from that fateful night in 1944. And he got it in June of 2010 and was reputed to be the last living survivor of the USS Leopold. Well, she really got her hair up, because her uncle never got the Purple Heart, and there were only 28 survivors. This is a very interesting ship. It's a destroyer escort. I've met one sailor here who served in the Pacific on it. I'm Army background. I spent 30 years. I'm a retired colonel. I know an awful lot about the ground. I know nothing about water except you shower in it, flush in it, and drink it. I get seasick on my kayak, so it's, you know, I'm not the guy to be writing the book, but I'm the last really living survivor who knows anything about it. In either case, Harry got the Purple Heart. Well, my daughter is tenacious, and she traced her way through the network of Washington, D.C., and got into Coast Guard headquarters. Now you may ask, well, why Coast Guard? This was a Coast Guard ship. In World War II, the Navy assumed all of the Coast Guard fleet. And we'll get into that a little bit later. And she located an individual named Deneen Day, a lovely lady in charge of awards and ceremonies, who said, well, that's all well and good, you know, your uncle was on that ship, yeah, we do know about it, it's very famous, they do have a memorial at the Coast Guard Academy. She said, but I can't just grant you a Purple Heart because he survived. Okay, not a problem. I didn't know any of this. This was all Greek to me. And I'm going to try to do this without making too much of a mess. I was going to play an audio, but I'm going to wait a minute. This is me in my sunglasses. I know I look like a mafia hitman. It is me. That's my young sister, who is 91. And that fellow with the 2 stars on his shoulders is Rear Admiral Daniel Neptune, who commands the 1st Coast Guard District, or did until about 6 weeks ago, when he was replaced by Admiral Abel. Dan is now down in Washington, number 2, in charge of the Coast Guard. So here we are. We've got this tape that survived all these years. Oh, and the real beauty of it is she recorded it on her young brother's Fisher-Price tape recorder. Okay? Battery-powered. So we get this call that they have researched, and they do want to give Sparky, that was my brother, a Purple Heart. He died in '97. And they gave me 2 choices. They said, we can send it to you in the mail, along with a whole bunch of other medals that we've determined he deserves, or we can have a presentation. And I called my daughter, and again, it's the same people, but I threw in 2 of my 3 kids. My daughter could not make it out from California. Some of you may recognize that. That's the building down on Winter Island, which used to be the U.S. Coast Guard Air Station, and I felt if we're going to have a ceremony, it should be at a Coast Guard station. And I was aghast when about a week before the planned ceremony, the Coast Guard called and said, would you mind if the Admiral came down with the color guard and the photographers and everybody else? And I said, an Admiral? They said, yeah, he's never presented a Purple Heart in his entire career, and he's next in command to take over the whole service. And I said, I'd be delighted, absolutely delighted. And what a gentleman. And that is the Purple Heart. For those who have never seen it, I have it, and you can take a look at it afterwards. And again, this goes way back to 1944. The Purple Heart has been given to those who are wounded in battle, usually by an instrument of war. It's for bravery, for courage, fidelity. I mean, you all know what it's about, but what a lot of you don't know is it goes back to George Washington. And I believe 1790 is the exact date that it was created. The ceremony was last May 21st. And that should have been the end of this whole thing. We got the medal. My 91-year-old sister, who was asked if she could stand for 5 minutes to accept the award, and I really wanted her to accept it, said, it's my brother, I can stand for 5 days. Okay? And she did. 91 years old, God bless her. We got the medal, went home, had a nice lunch, you know, the kids were excited and so on and so forth. And I was really kind of disappointed that my daughter couldn't fly in from California, but it was so much to arrange and, you know, all the people involved and getting flights, and it just wasn't going to be. And the bottom line of all this is, you know, that should have been the end of it. It wasn't. It was the beginning. I got another email from her a week later saying, Dad, you know, I've been on these blog sites. There are still families asking questions about that ship 70 years later. They don't know what happened to their family members. And I said, you gotta be kidding me. So I started to go in on it. And I found people like Mary Costello, who my daughter talked to in great detail, whose father was Charles Bradley. And he died on the Leopold. And Charles Bradley is a direct descendant of Bradley from Connecticut, who was one of the original signers of the Declaration of Independence, representing the state of Connecticut. And I'm saying, God, there's a lot of history on that ship that went down. So I started to search the internet, and poor Harry Dobby, the last living survivor, turns out not to be the last living survivor. There were two others. There was a fellow named Armin Bergen, and if we've got some time here, and I gotta be careful about this, I'll play you about 8 or 9 minutes of a recording of Armin. And I believe, and I can get these ages wrong, that Armin is the youngster in this story. He's only 85. Well, Armin was quite the character. He went to join the Navy right after the war started in '41, and the Navy turned him down because he was, as they called him, too damn young. He was 16, get the hell out of here. But in those days, the Coast Guard, which had about 10,000 active duty personnel, was getting a brunt of the duty in the early parts of the war. So from every, as I understand it, from every Navy recruiting station, there was a Coast Guardsman across the street waiting for the rejects. And they did this, and they took him in. And they said, but, oh, bring your birth certificate back tomorrow. He didn't bother. All right, he wanted to serve, and he served at age 16. In fact, that whole crew, other than a few officers, I think the oldest was 33, and most of them were teenagers, 20 or 21. They were total rookies. So in either case, we find him, and then we find a third person named Gail Fuller, who's in a nursing home in Minnesota. And I got a hold of his nephew, and I said, gee, you know, we didn't know he existed. And his nephew said, well, he's really sharp as a tack. He's kind of frail. And I mentioned to him how my brother just got the Purple Heart. And he said, well, my uncle never got it. And I said, you gotta be kidding me. And he said, no. And I said, well, let me make a few phone calls. I'm kind of on first name basis down there in Washington. I'll see what I can do. And I made a call down. And, yeah, forgive me, I'm drying up fast. I get the same damn response. Well, we got to check the medical records. I said, but he's one of those 3 living survivors now, not 1. Well, we still got to check the medical records. And it took a few months to get a phone call back to say, he doesn't qualify. I said, what do you mean he doesn't qualify? He doesn't qualify. He wasn't injured. I said, he was in the water from about 10 after 8 to 2:30 in the morning with nothing but a life vest swimming in 44-degree water. I mean, he had suffered all kinds of hypothermic injuries to his legs, his arms, and doesn't qualify. And I said, not acceptable. Well, it took a few more months, and they came back to me and they said, you know, the powers that be upstairs here has decided he does deserve the Purple Heart. And I said, thank you. So if you read the Minnetonka, Minnesota Sun-Times, I believe it's March 9 this year, you will see that Gail Fuller received the Purple Heart at the nursing home with a turnout of about 600 people, including an awful lot of brass, including Army generals, admirals, Coast Guard members, you name it. I mean, the guy was delighted. So anybody in his right mind would say, it's over. Go home, start playing golf, you're getting close to retirement, you've got better things to do in life, want to get out in the willows, do some kayaking. It just kept falling out of the sky. One thing after another just kept falling out of the sky. And I started to listen to the tapes, and then one day I get a call from one of the Coast Guard historians, Bill Thiessen, down in Portsmouth, Virginia. And he said, I just got an email from a lady in Texas who's just written a book. And I'm wondering, why are you telling me this? It's got to do with me. And I said, well, that's interesting. A book on what? Well, it's called A War of Her Own. It's a romantic historical novel of some young lady and her romantic adventures at a shipyard in Texas during the war. And I'm going, I'm trying to put this together, but it's not really registering very well with me. And I said, okay, that's fine. What does that mean? So I contacted her, and it turned out that she was an author. She's published some 8, 9, 10 books, got another one coming out at the end of this month. And her history goes back to Orange, Texas, where she was born and raised. And she's approximately my age. She's 71 as we sit here today. And it turns out that her parents and cousins and uncles and aunts worked at this shipyard in Texas. And I went, okay, great. So, why are you telling me all this? She said, well, I understand your brother got the Purple Heart for being on the Leopold. And I said, yes, he did. Well, that's where it was built, at Consolidated Shipyards in Orange, Texas, and half of my family worked on that ship. And I said, you gotta be kidding. And she said, no. And she said, that's a signal from above. We gotta do something about this. And I said, well, maybe you're right. Maybe we do. So a few weeks later, she's at a book signing somewhere in Texas. I don't even want to guess where. And a little old lady walks in. I mean, really, with a walker and can barely move, and she's clutching a photo. And walks up, and she's got the book, A War of Her Own, and she said, would you autograph this one? And Sylvia signs it, and she says, what's the picture you're carrying? And she turns around and shows a picture of her brother, Walter Umar Jr., who served on the Leopold, because the Leopold's in her book, along with the Joyce, the sister ship. And she said, I never knew what happened to him. I was 6 years old when the ship went down. Well, I was 11 months old when the ship went down. And she said, I've never been able to find out. So Sylvia calls me up and she says, I got this woman. You got to contact her. You got to talk to her. And I said, well, what am I going to say? And then I can remember when we did the presentation last May with the Silvas up here, and God bless them, they did a great presentation of the Purple Heart that the Admiral presented. We talked for a while, and we played my brother's interview that my daughter had made, 20, 25 years ago. And he's on a life raft, and he's trying, and he's slapping this guy named Walter around because he's falling asleep. And as you fell asleep in that cold, in that water, you died. And he eventually did expire on the raft and was released after taking his life jacket for other people. And it's her brother. And it's my brother. And I'm going, I can't handle this. This is getting to me too much. So, in either case, we've got the torpedoing here, and this was a crew of 200. It was actually, legally speaking, 199. There was one poor Navy fellow who was hitching a ride back to England. Never made it. This was convoy CU-16, which departed New York City around the 1st of March, 1944. This ship was one of 6 Coast Guard manned destroyer escorts. What people don't know about the war, prior to the war, the Germans were kind of having a field day, attacking almost anything, including ocean liners. And Roosevelt was getting a little steamed up about it, but the country was not ready for a war. Obviously, we weren't ready until Pearl Harbor. But his chief of naval operations, Admiral Stark, was really getting panicky. And he didn't have enough ships in the Atlantic to take merchant ships over to help the English to save Britain. And he requested that Roosevelt allow him to take all the Coast Guard cutters, from the big 360-footers right down to the 140-footers, assign them to the Navy, and help escort, with the Navy escorts across the Atlantic to get supplies delivered. Well, Roosevelt looked at him and he said, you can have them, but you take it all. You take the buoy tenders, you take the air station, you take it all. You can't pick and choose. So in October 1940, the Coast Guard was officially transferred to the United States Navy. They maintained their rank, their insignia, but they were now under the auspices of the Navy. The war obviously broke out December 7th, 41. We were very short of ships. were also short of manufacturing. That little town in Orange, Texas in 1940 was about 6,500 people. By the end of 1941, that little Orange, Texas now supported a population of 75,000 in less than. And they were shipbuilders. The United States had some destroyers. They were using the Coast Guard cutters before the war. There were 6 beautiful pearly white Coast Guard cutters that were taking these convoys across the ocean. And they kept them white because these were rescue ships. That's the main mission of the Coast Guard: protection, monitor riverways and navigational sites and all this other stuff. So they kept them white until they realized that the Germans were shooting at anything and everything. So they were ordered to be painted navy gray, and as soon as the ship was painted, the crew was offered leave. The world's record is one ship, one of these 360-foot cutters, was painted in 45 minutes. It's demonstrable. It's an incredible story, but they just had 55-gallon drums of paint, and they just poured the paint all over the decks and took brooms and swashed it everywhere and got their leave. I don't know if it's dry till this day. But it was up to the cutters to protect. But after the war, I mean, we were taking a beating. This is about the Battle of the North Atlantic. And in fact, it was so bad in the years 42, 43, it was called, forgive me, it was called the Bloody Winter. And why is it bloody? I think the statistics, I'm going to throw them out to you. Remember, there were 200 men on the Leopold, 28 survived, just 28. And this book isn't about all this history, although it's part of it. It's about what those 28 people went through that night. These are all going to be personal stories. The North Atlantic claimed 60,000 lives in World War II, men, women, and children. It claimed 3,000 ships, 200 warships, 2,000 aircraft, and 750 U-boats. A horrible area. It was called Torpedo Junction. South of Greenland, about 400 miles, some of the roughest weather and seas you could find anywhere. Even the Germans had a name for it, and they called it the Devil's Gorge. Gives you a pretty good idea. So in either case, we're in the war now, and we're starting to build these ships, and the Navy decided that it took too long to build destroyers, which were great defenses against submarines, but they were A, too expensive, and B, they took too long. So they came up with a design called the Destroyer Escort, the original tin can. And there were tin cans, believe me. And that's just for your perusing. There's some inadequacies in some of the stuff I'm showing you, but that's okay. Before I go on, that's my brother on the right, Coast Guard uniform. My other brother was in the Army. And there I am. After the sinking, I can barely stand up, okay? So I wasn't too knowledgeable about what was happening here. And that's my brother, I believe, just probably after the sinking, home on leave. He's got a nice smile for a guy who went through hell and back. We owned a local grocery store, Nelson Spar, which is now Mandy's in Salem. And some of you may recognize his dearest friend, who they just named the courthouse after. That's Mike Rain up there. And my brother ran his campaign for decades. He's just the kind of guy he was. Always for others, never for himself. And this is for Johnny Kapnis, who's sitting back here, because he keeps claiming they beat the hell out of Tully Square. And I want to tell you, that's the Tully Square ball team from the 50s. Well, here we are in Orange, Texas. Unfortunately, this is the only surviving photo of the Leopold. They haven't even got the numbers on it yet, which is really kind of sad, but it is what it is. It's the 319, DE 319. There was, as I said, I believe 563 destroyer escorts were built literally in 1 year around the country in 17 shipyards. But this consolidated in Texas took the cake. They built 93 destroyer escorts and 55 other ships in less than 18 months. Now, you talk about a war, you really wonder in this day and age, would we do that again if we had to? And I seriously doubt it. But there were 30 of these assigned to the Coast Guard. The Navy took the rest and shipped them from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean to the Pacific. They were all over the place. But the Coast Guard took 30 of them, and they made 5 divisions, escort divisions, of 6 ships each. And the Leopold and her sister ship, plus the Joyce, plus the Poole, the Peterson, the Kirkpatrick, and the Haverson, went to war as shipmates, all 6 of them. They were all launched within 6 weeks of each other in this same shipyard. The crews were from all over the country, but predominantly southern states. I guess the Southerners enlisted before the Northerners, I don't know why. But they were all shipped down to Orange, Texas to greet their ship. Some of them got there and the armament wasn't even put on yet. And to hear some of these stories when all these young sailors come into a town and wipe out a local 5 and dime for everything they got on the shelves and so on and forth is actually hysterical. I show you this so that you can get an idea. The Leopold and her sister ships were of what we call the Edsel class. Not that that means a whole lot. But this is the 766. This is a Cannon-class destroyer escort. It's the only one left in the United States. We gave them all away after World War II. Some of them went up through Korea. This guy is actually in the Hudson River. It floats. It's beautiful. Doesn't run. Doesn't run. It was given to the Greek Navy.
What's the armor? What are the big guns?
Oh, those are 3-inch-50s.
Thank you.
It was given to the Greek Navy and a bunch of salty old DE sailors. And for those of you who are in this room, there is an association, the Destroyer Escort Sailors of America. It's thinning out as time goes on, but they are very active, as are other groups from other military services, in preserving this ship. They raised, I believe, like $250,000 or 250,000. The Greeks gave it back to us. We gave it to them. They trashed it. I mean, they just trashed it. It was a rust bucket. And these people got together, bought it, had it towed across the Atlantic for $250,000, and had been working on this for 20 years to restore it. And you know what? It's almost done. In fact, when it was first towed to New York Harbor and going up the Hudson, I mean, the FBI, CIA, everybody was all over it because it had all its cannons on it. And they were, you can't do that. It's illegal. You've got to disarm every weapon on this ship. And they're going, it's a museum. But they got it up the Hudson.